Jonathan's face darkened, and the file slipped from his hand, hitting the tile with a sharp crack. Liam and Caleb kept stomping their feet, laughter ringing through the kitchen as their small hands lifted high, urging him to join their circle. Naomi turned, hair falling loose across her face, her eyes blazing in defiance. "What are you waiting for?" Jonathan took one step forward, then froze. The air tightened, every gaze fixed on him, waiting. Jonathan Ward sat in silence at the polished wooden table, his eyes bloodshot from a sleepless night. In front of him, contracts lay stacked in messy piles, yet the pen in his hand trembled, unable to form a single word. He had once conquered the tech world with cold precision, but now the sound of children's footsteps in the hallway tightened his chest. Losing his wife during childbirth had left him with a fear he could never shake, that his twin boys would live forever in silence, and that all his wealth and power could never pull them out of it. Inside the grand lakeside estate, Liam and Caleb, the twins born without hearing, played quietly with wooden blocks, their eyes drifting, unfocused. If Jonathan failed, he risked losing more than his reputation. He risked the fragile thread that still tied him to his sons. One morning, as Jonathan stepped into the kitchen, he found Naomi Ellis, the nanny with her hair tied neatly back, fingers still smudged with graphite, bending over a sheet of paper, sketching with a soft smile. The twins tilted their heads, watching closely, a sudden spark flickering in their eyes. Jonathan froze. That smile. It felt like the first gust of a storm waiting to sweep through a house that had been silent for far too long. Naomi set a small speaker on the kitchen shelf, a faint melody drifting into the quiet air. At first, Liam and Caleb only stirred, their eyes still unsure. Then Liam's little mouth broke into sudden laughter, bright and sharp, like a spark in a damp house. Caleb quickly followed, stomping his feet on the wooden floor, waving his arms clumsily. Naomi twirled in a circle, hair falling loose, her voice ringing clear. "That's it, just like that. Let your body do the talking." The children's laughter bounced off the walls, and in that very moment, Jonathan stepped in. The door swung open hard, the hinge shrieking, freezing everyone in place. The file in his hand slid to the floor, papers scattering everywhere. His cold eyes swept across the room, locking on Naomi's hands holding tight to his son's. His voice cut sharply, every word like a blade. "What do you think you're doing? This isn't some cheap daycare." The kitchen fell silent. Liam trembled, slipping his hand from Naomi's. Caleb lowered his head, hiding his face against her shirt. Naomi stood still, chest rising fast, her eyes refusing to back down. She spoke slowly, every word steady like a recording played back. "I gave them joy." "Joy isn't a trick." Jonathan let out a short, bitter laugh, tilting his head. "Joy?" A few minutes of noise, then back to silence. "You call that healing? You're paid to clean, not to put on a show." The words sliced through the room, humiliation laid bare in front of the children. Naomi bit her lip, hands tightening, but her eyes held firm. The next day in the living room, Naomi neatly stacked the toys. Suddenly, Caleb pulled an old leather notebook from the cabinet, its worn and faded cover. Curious, he flipped through a few pages, filled with heavy lines of handwriting, shaky as if written in long, sleepless nights. Naomi's eyes caught a name etched on the first page. Rachel. She drew in a breath, then turned one more page. "I'm afraid I'm not enough. Afraid I'll always fail them." Jonathan's confession was a fracture no one had ever seen. Naomi quickly closed the book, but just then, his voice thundered from behind. "Who gave you permission to touch that?" Naomi jumped, the notebook slipping onto the carpet. Jonathan stood at the door, his eyes blazing, his voice low and rough. "So curious you turned my pain into conversation?" The twins huddled close together, staring at their father in fear. Naomi bent to pick up the notebook, her hand trembling, but before she could speak, Jonathan stepped forward, his shadow blocking the light pouring through the window. Naomi gripped the notebook tight, her lips parting to answer, but Jonathan's ragged breath drowned everything else. The room thickened with silence, heavy and waiting, as if the subsequent explosion could strike anywhere. Jonathan yanked the leather notebook from Naomi's hands, his grip shaking. The air grew so heavy that Liam and Caleb clung to each other, their wide eyes frozen in fear. Naomi stood still, her lips drained of color, but her head unbowed. She wanted to speak, but her throat locked tight. Just then, the sharp sound of footsteps echoed from the doorway. A middle-aged man in a pressed suit walked in. It was Dr. Alan Morris, the therapist Jonathan had invited to assess the twins' progress. His cool gaze behind half-rimmed glasses swept across the chaotic scene. "Mr. Ward," he said in a low voice, "I just saw the boys laughing in the hallway. But I'm afraid that's only surface behavior. Deaf children sometimes mimic adults. It doesn't mean real progress." Naomi's face burned, her fists gripping her dress. Jonathan turned away, but the words cut deep, striking an old wound. Alan stopped at the rug, stooping to pick up a loose page that had slipped from the notebook. His eyes narrowed as he read the shaky line. "I don't know if I'm enough to be a father." Alan looked up, his tone hard as steel. "That's the heart of the problem. You never believed in yourself. How can you expect your children to believe in you?" The words pierced Jonathan like a blade. His chest heaved, anger rising. Naomi opened her mouth, but Alan lifted his chin and pressed on. "And you, the maid, don't feed false hope. Fleeting joy doesn't change reality. The worst mistake is letting him believe in something that isn't real." Naomi shivered. The twins stared at her, bewildered, as if they couldn't grasp why their happiness had been dismissed so cruelly. Jonathan clutched the notebook, his face darkening. Then Alan pulled out his phone, his voice clipped and cold. "I'll file a report immediately. If this continues, the family court may reevaluate custody. They could decide Mr. Ward isn't fit to raise them." Jonathan froze, his whole body stiff as if bound. If that happened, he wouldn't just lose his reputation, he could lose his sons. Naomi gasped. "You can't write that. You haven't been here long enough to understand." Alan waved her off, his tone dripping with disdain. "I work with evidence. A few noisy minutes of laughter aren't progress. That's false data." Suddenly, Liam rushed forward, tugging Naomi's sleeve, signing clumsily a single word. "Mom!" Caleb followed instantly, his eyes shining. The room shook with the weight of a forbidden word Jonathan had buried for years. Jonathan staggered, his face drained. Alan smirked. "See? They're confused. Even more dangerous if this bond grows in the wrong place." The air turned suffocating. Naomi clutched her chest, choking back a sob. Jonathan gripped the notebook, breathing hard, unable to speak. The ticking clock on the wall hammered every second into the silence. Then his eyes caught something. On the fallen page near Alan's shoe, a smudge of ink bled across the words, as if someone had tried to erase or alter them. Jonathan narrowed his gaze, his heart pounding. Before he could react, Alan's phone lit up with a new message, and the room sank into a silence thick with suspicion. Dr. Allen's phone rang, its screen lighting up in the center of the living room. A new notification popped up where everyone could see. "Preliminary report submitted to the family council. Ward case." Jonathan froze, blood pounding in his temples. He lunged forward and tore the phone from Alan's hand. "You filed a report before even meeting my children." His voice was raw, his hands shaking. Alan flinched, then quickly regained his cold composure. "I relied on the existing records. What I just witnessed only confirms them." Naomi stepped closer, her voice trembling but firm. "That's a lie. You've never spent a single real hour with them." Jonathan gripped the phone tighter, a flicker of hope in his eyes. But Alan pulled out a folder of printed pages, flipping to the signature line. "Hospital records." It states, "The boy's verbal responses remain delayed, communication skills undeveloped." Jonathan read the words, each line pressing down on his chest. The spark of defense he'd felt was smothered in an instant. He looked up, fury burning in his eyes, but his throat was too dry to speak. Naomi hurried to the table, pulling a carefully folded page from her bag. Her hands trembled as she opened it. A rough but precise drawing by Caleb. Two tiny hands forming the sign for Papa, next to a shaky line Naomi had written when he tried to speak the word aloud. "This is evidence. I recorded every sign, every sound that day. Not imagination, not some illusion like you claim." The room stirred. Jonathan stared at the drawing, his breath caught. For a moment he felt the thin thread tying him to his sons. But Alan laughed, the sound brittle and sharp. A childish doodle? That's your proof? No court will accept something like that. Liam shot to his feet, slamming his hands on the table. His eyes wide, he signed again and again. Papa. Naomi froze, tears sliding down her cheeks onto the paper. Jonathan reached for his son, but Alan blocked him, his voice hard as iron. Touch them now and you'll only make things worse. The chance for release vanished before his eyes. Jonathan stood helpless, his large frame suddenly small and adrift in the room. The tension stretched thin as a wire. Then Caleb stepped forward, tugged Naomi's sleeve, and pressed a crumpled slip of paper into her hand. She unfolded it, an old worn receipt. It bore the date when Rachel, Jonathan's late wife, had once taken the twins to a special music therapy class, months before she passed. At the bottom, a note read, "Both boys respond well to drum rhythms. Signs of progress." Jonathan staggered, as if struck by lightning. A truth never spoken before stopped him cold. His wife had believed. She had seen hope. Alan lunged to snatch it away, but Naomi was faster, clutching it tight in her palm. Every gaze in the room locked on the faded receipt, once meaningless, now a key. Into the silence, a rough, weathered voice broke through. The elderly housekeeper, who had stood quietly by the door all this time, spoke each word with the weight of stone. "There are things Mr. Carter has kept from all of us." The room went still. Jonathan lifted his head, his eyes wide, unable to respond. The housekeeper's words struck the air like a hammer. "There are things Mr. Ward has kept from all of us." Jonathan spun around, his face paling. Naomi clutched the faded receipt, while Alan stood still, a half-smirk tugging at his mouth. Liam and Caleb stared in confusion, their eyes widening with the vague sense that something important was about to break free. The housekeeper trembled as she stepped forward, her thin arms wrapped around a dark wooden box. She set it on the table with a hollow thud that silenced the room. Slowly, she lifted the lid. Inside lay a stack of papers, a few photographs, and an old cassette tape. "Before Mrs. Rachel passed," she said in her raspy voice, "I promised to keep what she left for the children. But Mr. Ward, he locked it all away." Naomi's eyes widened. Jonathan moved quickly as if to stop her, but the housekeeper stood firm. "Enough, sir. The truth needs to be heard, especially by these two boys." She pressed play. A hiss of static filled the air, then the gentle, unmistakable voice of Rachel. On the third day of therapy, Liam laughed when he heard the drums. Caleb lifted his hands to play along. "I believe, if we had more time, they'd open their own world. Jonathan doesn't believe. He's afraid of hope. But I'll keep the evidence until he's ready." The room went still. Jonathan's hands gripped the back of a chair, his nails digging into the wood. His breath came fast, eyes reddened, though he fought to keep control. Naomi turned, her voice breaking. "You knew. All along?" Jonathan stiffened, then gave the slightest nod. "I saw the notes, but I couldn't." Alan cut in, his tone sharp as ice. "Couldn't or wouldn't. You chose to bury it, to protect yourself, to avoid the pain. That's no reason to raise children." Jonathan roared, his voice splintering. "What do you know? The day my wife died, I stood in that white room while two babies cried without sound. I was terrified. I feared that if I hoped again and lost it, I wouldn't survive." The cry made Liam and Caleb burst into tears. Naomi rushed to them, pulling them close, her hands shaking as she soothed them. The housekeeper whispered, "But you let fear bury everything Rachel left behind. That's the truth." Jonathan staggered into a chair, bearing his head in his hands, every gaze fixed on him. Naomi's eyes held not only anger, but also a trace of compassion. She drew a deep breath and pulled a folded paper from her pocket. Placing it before him, she spoke with quiet force. It was an official therapy report, signed by the attending doctor, confirming, "Children respond positively to rhythm and body movement, encouraging progress. This isn't just emotion, this is evidence." Alan faltered, words drying in his throat. Naomi lifted a photograph next, Rachel kneeling beside the twins as their small hands beat on drums, joy shining across their faces. In the corner, Rachel's scrawled handwriting read, "Happiest day." They will grow, I believe. Jonathan held the photo, his hands trembling. He bent forward, his broad shoulders shaking. At last, after years of restraint, tears rolled down his face. You hid it. You made us believe there was nothing. Naomi's voice was soft but sharp enough to pierce the room. Liam toddled forward, tugged his father's hand, and signed one word again and again. Papa. Caleb followed, his small hands shaking as he copied the words. Jonathan looked at his sons, his throat closing, then turned to Naomi. But Alan's voice cut in, cold as a gavel. Tears don't change the law. The council will ask why you deliberately hid the evidence. You didn't just fail, you concealed the truth. Jonathan's face drained, Alan's words dragging him to the edge of despair. The stakes were no longer reputation. They were custody of his own children. The air thickened. Naomi drew breath to speak, but the housekeeper clutched the wooden box tighter, fixing Jonathan with her gaze. It's time to choose, confess everything, or lose them forever. Jonathan's eyes glistened, his lips parted, but no words came. A sharp knock rattled the door. A woman in a dark suit stepped inside, notebook in hand, her voice firm. I'm a representative from the Guardianship Council. The evaluation begins now. The room held its breath. Jonathan turned to Naomi, then to his sons, clutching each other's hands. No one dared move. No one dared breathe. Then from the back of the room, an elderly neighbor stood and spoke. I saw Rachel take the boys to music class. I even heard them laugh. Mr. Ward didn't make this up. The testimony struck like a sudden beam of light, and the council members stiffened in response. The tension shifted, waiting to erupt. A silence stretched, heavy and unbearable. And in that silence, Jonathan whispered, so low it cut the air like a blade. I have nothing left to hide. The room froze, bracing for the storm about to break. The grand hall of the lakeside estate glowed under bright lights. Chairs lined up in 2 long rows, with a table at the center holding files and microphones. At the head sat the 3 members of the Guardianship Council. Behind them, rows of onlookers, former staff, neighbors, even friends of Rachel who had known the family. The air was heavy, like a courtroom brought into a living room. Jonathan entered in a black suit that only made his pale face look paler. Naomi guided Liam and Caleb to the front row, the boys clutching her hands. The crowd whispered, eyes fixed on Jonathan with a mix of pity and suspicion. Dr. Allen rose first, his voice carrying through the microphone. Members of the council, I've observed these 2 boys. While there have been fleeting emotional reactions, there's no sign of lasting development. More importantly, Mr. Ward deliberately hid evidence, misleading everyone about their true condition. Murmurs rippled through the room. Jonathan stood frozen, fists clenched, unable to speak. Allen opened a file, lifting it high for all to see. Here are Mr. Ward's own words. I'm not enough to be a father. I fear I'll always fail. If he doubts himself this deeply, how can this council trust his ability to raise them? The pages fluttered to the table with a dry slap. Jonathan looked up, his face drawn tight. He gripped the microphone, his voice shaking. Yes, I wrote those words. But they came from my darkest days. I never stopped being there for my sons. The crowd scoffed, a few heads shaking in disappointment. An older neighbor muttered, Who's seen him with those boys in years? The air tightened. Jonathan tried to push on, his voice cracking. I was afraid, but I didn't abandon them. I just didn't know how. Allen strode closer, his words like steel. You were afraid, so you hid the truth. You were afraid, so you turned Rachel's last hope into ashes. That's not love. That's cowardice. His palm slammed the table, the sound echoing through the hall. Liam flinched, clutching Caleb, both boys' eyes wide with fear. Naomi wrapped her arms around them, whispering comfort, though anger trembled through her own body. Jonathan tried to rise, but his legs faltered. The lights overhead caught the sweat on his brow, each stare from the audience stabbing like needles. He reached for the microphone, his voice breaking apart. The crowd had already begun to believe in his defeat. Allen smiled, victorious, holding the file aloft again. His tone rang out like a verdict. Look at this. Proof that he's unfit. And if the council wants to spare these children further harm, the decision should be made today. The hall erupted. A few claps scattered from the back, sharp as knives in Jonathan's chest. He slumped into his chair, his eyes red, his lips trembling, as he stared at his children, yet was unable to form words. Naomi turned to him, shaking her head softly, tears shimmering in her eyes. The air thickened like smoke. Light fell across the stern faces of the three council members. One reached for the gavel, ready to bring it down. At that very moment, the elderly housekeeper rose from the last row. Her frail hands trembled, but her voice rang clear as a bell. Wait! They need to see this first. Every head turned. In her hands was a thick envelope, its edges still sealed. She held it high, the white light glinting off its surface. The hall went silent, every breath caught as all eyes fixed on what she carried. The housekeeper's hands trembled as she laid the thick envelope on the table. The hall went silent, broken only by the crackle of paper as she tore the seal. Photos, notes, and receipts from therapy sessions spilled out, spread before the council. Naomi stepped forward quickly, lifting one page. Her voice rang out, echoing through the hall. This is the doctor's signature from when Rachel was alive. It confirms that the boys responded positively to music. This isn't a trick. It isn't mimicry. This is the truth. The room stirred, then fell quiet again as Naomi held the document high for all to see. Eyes that had judged a moment ago now wavered. Jonathan rose, his shoulders trembling. He pulled a photograph from the pile. Rachel kneeling beside Liam and Caleb, her face glowing, their tiny hands beating a drum in rhythm. In the corner, Rachel's handwriting scrawled, "Happiest day." Jonathan lifted the photo with both hands, his voice unsteady but firm. My wife believed. I hid it out of fear, but today, before all of you, I won't hide anymore. This is the faith she left behind, and my sons have proven it true. Gasps swept the room, then silence. All eyes turned to the boys in the front row. As if pulled by an unseen thread, Liam stood and signed Papa with his small hand, his eyes shining. Caleb followed, raising his hand, his lips trembling. Pa, Pa. The hesitant sound struck like a bell, shattering years of silence. One council member leapt to their feet, stunned. The audience gasped, some breaking into sobs. Alan forced a weak smile, his voice faltering. It's just a reflex, temporary. But before he could finish, Naomi slammed a tape recorder on the table. Static crackled, then a child's voice rang out clear from the recording. Happy Papa. The hall erupted in shock. Jonathan gripped the microphone, his words pounding like hammers. No one can call this an illusion anymore. You're witnessing it yourselves. This is living proof. My children don't need permission to be loved. Applause burst out, spreading across the hall like fire. Neighbors who had doubted now rose to their feet, nodding. One council member set down the gavel slowly, eyes shining. There's no doubt. This is the truth. Alan stumbled back, his face stiff, eyes darting for escape. But no one listened anymore. Every gaze turned to Jonathan, the man once thought broken, now standing firm with his children in his arms. He bent down, pulling Liam and Caleb to his chest, his rough voice breaking into a vow. I was afraid once, but today I choose courage. No one will take away the faith Rachel and my sons gave me. The hall thundered with applause again, mingled with cries and shouts. Golden light fell across father and sons locked in their embrace, a living portrait of hope. But as the moment reached its height, Jonathan lifted his head, his eyes freezing. From the back row, a figure rose. The woman in the dark suit, the council's representative, stepped forward, holding another file in her hand. The hall fell silent. Jonathan swallowed hard, his eyes fixed on the folder. He hadn't spoken yet, but the air was already tightening, bracing for the next turn. The woman in the dark suit strolled toward the long table. The file in her hand rustled, each sound cutting like a blade through the silence. The hall held its breath. Jonathan tightened his grip on his son's shoulders. Naomi and the housekeeper exchanged worried glances. The council representative set the file down, her voice steady and firm. We've reviewed not only Dr. Allen's report, but also all the new evidence presented here. The photos, the notes, even the recording. More importantly, every one of us just witnessed the boys communicate in this very room. She paused, her gaze moving from Jonathan to Naomi. The truth is clear. Custody belongs to Mr. Ward, but the room swayed with tension. Jonathan stiffened, his hands trembling. Everyone waited for the gavel to fall. The woman tilted her head, her eyes softening. We recommend Ms. Ellis remain as the children's primary caregiver. No one can deny she opened the door that no one else could. Naomi's breath caught, her eyes glistening as her lips pressed tight. The crowd nodded in unison, applause rising, not rhythmic, but raw with feeling. Alan, cornered, turned pale. He muttered, "Impossible," then scrambled to gather his files, slipping out the door under the cold stares of the audience. For the first time, the man who had stood in judgment left with his head bowed. As the hall erupted, Jonathan turned to Naomi. His throat dry, he bent low in apology. "I'm sorry for insulting you, for letting fear chain me. You were the only one who believed in what I tried to bury." Naomi's eyes shimmered. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she pulled a worn scrap of paper from her pocket. On it was a child's shaky scrawl. "Papa," beside Caleb's hand-drawn sign. "I kept this from the first day he wrote it. Not to prove it to you, but to remind myself. This miracle is real." Jonathan took the paper, his vision blurring. He tucked it into his breast pocket, as if sealing a vow. The old housekeeper stepped closer, her frail hand resting on his shoulder. "Rachel would be proud. Not because you won, but because you finally stepped out of the dark." Jonathan turned and for the first time bowed his head deeply to her. The silence between them broke, replaced with belated but genuine respect. That afternoon, the once quiet estate filled with laughter. Liam and Caleb ran across the garden, waving bright ribbons left from the hearing. Naomi sketched quickly, capturing their uneven strides with swift pencil lines. Jonathan sat on the porch, no longer the guarded businessman, but simply a father watching his children. When Caleb stumbled, Jonathan rushed forward without hesitation, catching him in his arms. The boy looked up, lips trembling. "Papa." Jonathan held him close and, for the first time, let out a laugh. It was rough and broken, but so real that Naomi, standing at a distance, burst into tears. Before leaving, the council representative turned back, leaving a final word. "Remember, justice isn't always about winning or losing. Sometimes it's simply letting the truth be seen." The door closed, but her words lingered in every heart. Justice doesn't always come from courtrooms or papers. It often rises in the moments when people dare to stand, to face the truth, and let the world see. And love, even late, can still heal. Have you ever witnessed a moment that changed someone's life forever? If this story touched you, share your thoughts below. Somewhere, someone may need to hear it to believe that hope and love never fade. Don't forget to follow for more stories that keep this warmth alive. The last light of day spilled through the glass, bathing father and sons in golden glow. Naomi watched quietly, her hand tight around her sketchbook. The story closed in silence, but hearts carried its echo, as if that light kept flowing on.